They dragged her out of first class like a criminal. No warning, no dignity, just because she was black. No raised voice, no missing ticket, no mistake. Just her skin, her silence, and the quiet decision someone made the moment they saw her. She doesn't belong here. That's what they thought. So they surrounded her seat, told her to stand, and marched her down the aisle while passengers looked away, too polite or too comfortable to intervene. No one knew her name. No one cared why she was there. But they all assumed she was in the wrong place. And that was their first mistake. Because the woman they just humiliated, she controls the money keeping that airline in the sky. This isn't just a story about racism at 30,000 feet. It's about what happens when the most underestimated person in the room turns out to be the one writing the checks. And believe me, she didn't yell. She didn't fight. She made one phone call and froze $125 million before the wheels even hit the ground. What would you have done if you'd been on that flight? Would you have said something? Would you have stayed silent? Drop your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe justice doesn't need a uniform to show up, hit that subscribe button. We've got more stories coming that you won't want to miss. Alexis Moore had been in dozens of airports, many of them more luxurious than this one. Yet today, as she stepped through the sleek, automatic doors of Terminal A at Westbridge International, something about the air felt heavier. The coolness of the polished marble beneath her heels, the soft hum of departure announcements, and the clinking of coffee cups in the distance. These were familiar cues to someone in her field. She adjusted the strap of her designer laptop bag, glancing at the digital departure board to confirm what she already knew. Flight 2187 to New York. First class. On time. With a subtle, confident breath, Alexis made her way to the first-class check-in counter, her platinum-tier boarding pass in hand. The young man at the desk wore a pressed uniform and a name tag that read Tyler. His smile widened for the elderly white couple ahead of her, and he helped them with extra care, even walking around the counter to ensure the husband had assistance with his cane. Alexis didn't mind the wait. She was used to traveling alone and had no illusions about special treatment. But when it was finally her turn, Tyler's entire demeanor shifted. His gaze fell to her skin, then flicked to her briefcase, then back to her face. "Ma'am," he said, his voice light but firm, "this line is for first-class passengers only." Alexis offered a polite smile, holding out her boarding pass without flinching. "That's me," she said calmly. "Alexis Moore, Flight 2187. Tyler took the pass hesitantly, scanning it with a slight squint as if he expected it to error out. It didn't. The screen chirped its usual approval tone. Instead of apologizing or acknowledging the mistake, he simply glanced past her and called out, "Next in line." Stunned but composed, Alexis stepped aside, collecting her documents. She'd encountered this before, not the system error, but the human one. Sometimes subtle, sometimes not. It was in the way people's eyes questioned how she belonged, even as proof sat plainly in their hands. She walked toward the exclusive lounge, past other travelers in designer coats and tech executives barking into headsets. The golden emblem of the Skylux Elite Lounge shimmered beneath the overhead lights. A woman in a tight bun stood at the entrance, checking names and scanning passes with robotic efficiency. When Alexis reached her, the woman looked up, then immediately scanned her from top to bottom, not with admiration, but suspicion. "Excuse me," she said, a hint of ice in her voice. "This lounge is restricted. Are you here to assist a guest?" It was phrased like a question, but Alexis knew it wasn't one. The implication hit like a cold slap. She raised her chin slightly, her tone unchanged. "I'm a first-class passenger," she replied evenly, handing over her boarding pass again. The woman blinked, clearly not expecting that. She scanned the pass. Again, the confirmation tone chirped. Still no apology. "Enjoy your stay," the woman said curtly, stepping aside. Inside the lounge, the atmosphere was a world apart. Glass walls overlooking the runway, leather seating, jazz playing faintly through hidden speakers. Champagne bottles glimmered behind the bar. Alexis took a seat by the window, keeping her posture composed, her breath steady. She'd built her entire legal career on that steadiness, on never letting others dictate her sense of worth. But the truth lingered behind her eyes like an unwelcome shadow. Even here, at the top of her game, with credentials that could floor a courtroom and investments in portfolios most of these passengers would never see, even here, she was expected to be anything but who she truly was. As she sipped a lukewarm coffee that had arrived 5 minutes late, Alexis reminded herself of the reason for this trip. It wasn't just another client. She had been appointed as the legal executor of a Langston estate, a trust managing nearly $1 billion in assets, including 21% ownership of the very airline she was flying with today. The irony didn't sting. It burned. Across the room, a man in a navy suit whispered something to his wife, nodding in Alexis's direction. His wife turned and gave a brief, almost imperceptible shake of the head. Alexis didn't need to hear the words to understand. She had heard them in different forms her entire life. "You don't belong here." But she did. Not only that, she owned part of here. She glanced again at her watch. Boarding would begin soon. She gathered her things, rechecking her documents out of habit. Not fear, just preparation. In law and in life, she'd learned that documentation was power, and power needed to be ready when called. As she stood to leave, she caught one last look from Tyler, the check-in agent, now idly chatting with a coworker. He didn't see her anymore. Hadn't from the beginning. But that would change. Not through confrontation, through revelation. And it would start the moment she set foot on that plane. The moment Alexis exited the Skylux lounge to head toward her departure gate, a slow tension began to rise again like steam under pressure. She walked with deliberate poise through the quiet halls of Terminal A, her heels clicking steadily against the polished floor. Her boarding pass, still held firm in her hand, displayed the unmistakable F1 code, First Class, Row 1. Her name, Alexis Moore, printed in bold capital letters, was impossible to mistake. Yet eyes continued to follow her as if the badge of legitimacy she carried somehow didn't apply to her skin, her hair, her presence. As she passed through the second-tier security checkpoint designated exclusively for first-class passengers, she nodded politely to the guard stationed nearby, a tall man with sunburned skin and mirrored sunglasses. He didn't nod back. Instead, he subtly lowered his gaze to her ID and held it a moment longer than necessary. He didn't scan it. He didn't say a word. Then, in a low voice over his shoulder, he whispered into the collar Mike clipped to his lapel, "We've got one we need to keep an eye on. Lady in Navy, seat F1. Might be a Ms. boarding flag." Alexis heard it. She wasn't meant to, but she did. And the timing of the whisper, just after her scan beeped green, wasn't lost on her. She held her breath, steady as stone, then walked through the private corridor without turning back. It wasn't rage she felt. Not yet. It was the quiet sting of being watched for reasons that had nothing to do with behavior and everything to do with bias. In her career, she dismantled boardrooms with a single clause, overturned wills that had cheated entire families, and out-argued men with 10 more years in the game. But none of that changed the way certain uniforms tensed when she walked by. As she neared the gate, a second security staffer emerged and stood near the boarding kiosk, arms crossed, clearly briefed. Alexis didn't falter. She stepped to the side, choosing to wait until the line shortened, watching others get waved through with warm nods and casual greetings. A white man in a tech hoodie and wrinkled slacks was ushered in with a pat on the back. "Enjoy the champagne up there," the agent laughed. A woman in leggings and AirPods barely looked up as she handed over her pass. No question, no scan delay. But when Alexis approached, her boarding pass already open, the agent, another young man named Troy, judging by his badge, cleared his throat. Ma'am, just one moment." He motioned behind her, flagging down the nearby guard who approached with calculated slowness. "Can I take another look at your ID?" Troy asked, already glancing suspiciously at her suit as though her confidence was a costume. Alexis didn't flinch. "Is there a problem?" she asked, maintaining the same calm, composed voice she used in depositions. "Just a routine verification," Troy replied, even as his eyes betrayed doubt. The guard took her license, looked at it, for a full 10 seconds, then handed it back without a word. The agent finally scanned her boarding pass again, still green. "You're clear," he muttered, with the bare minimum of professional courtesy. Alexis walked onto the jet bridge, her posture tall, her expression unreadable. But inside something coiled. Not anger, not yet, just memory. The memory of every room she had to enter twice, once to be ignored, and again to be acknowledged. Stepping onto the plane, Alexis was greeted by a young female attendant with a crisp ponytail and tight smile. "Good morning," she said to the passenger ahead of Alexis. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Crane." Then, with a glance at Alexis, "Hello," short, clipped, already turning away. Alexis walked to her seat, 1A, front row window, only to find her overhead bin already filled. A flight attendant appeared, one Alexis hadn't seen before, with the expression of someone perpetually unimpressed. "Can I help you?" he asked, as if she'd wandered into the wrong section. "This is my seat," Alexis said, gesturing to the bag above. "And I'd prefer to have my belongings near me." He exhaled lightly. "We're running out of space. You might have to check your bag." Before Alexis could respond, the man behind her, Mr. Crane, stepped forward. "Need some help with that?" he offered, flashing the same kind of smile people reserve for Girl Scouts and lost tourists. "I'm fine, thank you," Alexis replied coolly. She sat down, her body angled away from the aisle, the heat in her chest held firm beneath layers of practiced discipline. Minutes passed. A tray was offered to Mr. Crane, water, orange juice, champagne. Nothing was offered to Alexis. She rang the call button. Nothing happened. She rang it again. Still nothing. 10 minutes into boarding, a third attendant walked by, and Alexis made eye contact. "Excuse me," she said. "Can I have a glass of water, please?" The attendant didn't stop walking. "We'll come back when we're ready for beverage service." Alexis didn't speak again. She opened her leather folio, reviewing the printed reports inside, the ones detailing the quarterly investment outputs of the Langston Trust, the exact disbursement schedules, the agreement clauses that controlled over $125 million annually in aviation partnerships, including this airline, including this plane. She paused on one paragraph. Clause 9C. In the event of reputational or ethical breach directly involving shareholder-funded service, executor reserves right to suspend distribution pending review. She closed the folder softly, letting her palm rest on the gold crest embossed into the leather. She didn't need revenge. She had something stronger: control. And by the time this flight landed, those who had looked through her would have to look at her. And more importantly, they would have to answer to her. As Alexis settled into seat 1A, the friction she'd felt at the gate didn't dissipate. It sharpened. Her briefcase, tucked neatly beneath the seat in front of her, carried documents that outlined ownership stakes, pending legal motions, and the disbursement schedules that governed a fortune many of these passengers could only dream of. She adjusted the cuffs of her blazer and exhaled slowly, hoping, perhaps foolishly, that the worst of the microaggressions had passed. But the calm didn't last. A sharp click of heels approached from the front galley. Alexis looked up to see a woman in her mid-40s with platinum blonde hair wound tightly into a bun. Her uniform was crisp, her posture rigid, and her name tag read Brenda Chief Flight Attendant. Brenda halted directly in front of her, scanning the row with what Alexis immediately recognized as veiled suspicion. "Excuse me," Brenda began, tilting her head in forced politeness. "First class is located at the front of the aircraft." Alexis met her gaze evenly. "I know," she replied, reaching into her inside pocket and calmly producing her boarding pass. "This is seat 1A. My name is Alexis Moore." Brenda didn't take the pass immediately. Instead, her eyes narrowed, as if her brain was struggling to align Alexis's appearance with the information in front of her. After a pause, just long enough to make her intent clear, Brenda finally reached out and snatched the pass. She scanned it with her tablet and frowned. "Please wait here," she said, her tone cooling even further. "There might be a mismatch in our system." "There's no mismatch," Alexis said evenly. "That ticket was issued 2 weeks ago and confirmed by your airline this morning." Brenda didn't answer. She turned on her heel and marched toward the galley. Alexis sat back in her seat, her posture calm, but her blood warming. Passengers across the aisle turned to look, one woman craning her neck slightly, pretending not to eavesdrop as she clutched a Hermes blanket to her lap. A young man 3 rows back raised his eyebrows toward his companion and whispered something under his breath. A few seconds later, a middle-aged white man, business casual, silver cufflinks, just enough arrogance to match the surroundings, leaned toward Alexis and asked, "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Sometimes these booking apps mix things up. Alexis didn't flinch. "I'm sure," she said with a clipped smile. "I'm where I'm supposed to be." "Just checking," he muttered, leaning back with a shrug. Brenda returned, her face tight. She didn't apologize. "You'll need to step aside while we verify," she announced, not privately, not discreetly, but loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Alexis rose slowly, calmly. "Verify what exactly?" she asked, though she already knew. "Your presence in this seat," Brenda said. "There's just been confusion." Alexis allowed herself a single breath before responding. "My ticket is valid. My identity is verified. Your confusion has nothing to do with your system and everything to do with your assumptions." Brenda's eyes flashed with offense, but she didn't engage. Instead, she motioned toward a junior attendant and ordered, "Escort her to the front galley until this is sorted." The junior woman, nervous, barely in her 20s, approached timidly. "Ma'am, please." Alexis held up a hand gently. "No need to apologize," she said to the girl. "Let's go." She collected her briefcase, leaving her seat behind as the first-class cabin fell into an uncomfortable silence. As they passed rows of champagne glasses and polished shoes, Brenda whispered into her intercom headset, "Passenger 1A under review. Possible misallocation." In the front galley, Alexis stood by a bulkhead wall with arms crossed, her eyes flicking across the framed safety chart as if it were case law. From behind the curtain, she could hear passengers chatting more freely now that the issue had been removed. One voice murmured maybe she tried to upgrade at the counter and thought nobody would notice. Another replied, "Yeah, I mean she didn't exactly look the part." Alexis let those words settle, not because they hurt, but because they clarified. This wasn't about protocol. It never was. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The junior attendant returned with a hesitant expression. "Ms. Moore, I'm so sorry for the delay. Your documentation checks out. You're free to return to your seat." Alexis nodded once and walked past her without another word. As she re-entered the first-class cabin, she noticed how quickly conversations died. Eyes turned away. A few people shifted uncomfortably, but no one said a word. Brenda stood in place as Alexis walked by, but she didn't offer an apology. She only muttered, "Welcome aboard." Alexis didn't answer. She returned to seat 1A, placed her briefcase beneath the seat, and buckled in. Her expression was neutral, but the coil inside her chest was tightening. Not with anger, with purpose. She opened her leather folio once more and flipped to the section labeled Emergency Clauses Equity Partnerships. Her eyes focused on Clause 14E, the one detailing reputational breaches in service-based investments. It granted her authority, as executor of a Langston Trust, to freeze airline distributions in the event of deliberate discrimination, verbal misconduct, or breach of professional conduct impacting protected class passengers. Her fingers traced the bolded words. She closed the folio softly, letting it rest on her lap like a gavel not yet struck. They had asked whether she belonged. Now, she'd let the numbers answer. And numbers never lie. Barely 15 minutes had passed since Alexis reclaimed her seat in 1A, yet the tension in the cabin clung to the air like turbulence before storm. She kept her expression still as the aircraft's engines hummed softly in the background, masking the quiet conversations and sideways glances still drifting in her direction. Her fingers tapped lightly against the armrest, not in impatience, but in calculation. She could sense another wave of confrontation before it arrived, and when it did, it came precisely as expected. Brenda's return was announced not by words, but by her presence. Her posture was sharper this time, her eyes colder, her voice louder than necessary. "Ma'am," she began, projecting her words across rows that didn't need to hear them. "Our records still show a discrepancy with your seat assignment. You'll need to come with me, now." Alexis didn't move, didn't blink. "My documentation is confirmed. I was already cleared by your staff in your system." Brenda crossed her arms. "There seems to have been another update. You've been reassigned." "To where?" Alexis asked, though she already knew. Brenda gestured vaguely down the aisle. "To an open seat in the back. You'll still be on the flight. Please don't make this harder than it has to be." A few nearby passengers raised their brows. One woman clutched her pearl necklace, as if offended on Brenda's behalf. A man 2 rows back chuckled audibly and said, "Probably used airline points from a sweepstake and thought no one would notice." Alexis stood slowly, her movements precise, deliberate. "This won't be necessary," she said calmly. "I insist on remaining in the seat I paid for." Brenda's tone shifted, the edge hardening. "If you refuse to comply, I'll have no choice but to involve security personnel when we land." Alexis's jaw tightened, but her eyes didn't waver. She reached into her folio, pulled out a laminated copy of her boarding pass with a first-class label and seat clearly marked, and held it up between them like a courtroom exhibit. "This," she said evenly, "is not a misunderstanding. This is a message, one I receive clearly." Brenda didn't even look at the document. Instead, she took a half step back and motioned toward a younger flight attendant nearby. "Emily, please escort Ms. Moore to 32E. The junior attendant, clearly uncomfortable, hesitated, then approached. "Ma'am," she said gently, "if you would follow me." Alexis looked at her for a long second, then nodded. "Very well." She retrieved her bag, walked the length of the plane with dignity intact, passing rows of passengers whose eyes shifted away in choreographed denial. Some whispered, others pretended to sleep. The further back she walked, the colder the air seemed to feel. Finally, at the very rear of the aircraft, she arrived at 32E, middle seat. No window, no dignity. A toddler shrieked 2 rows back. A faint smell of bleach and metal filled the air. She placed her briefcase under the seat, sat down, and folded her hands in her lap. Her knees nearly touched the seat in front of her. The man on her left muttered something inaudible and turned his body away. The woman on her right kept glancing at Alexis's blazer, as though confused that someone dressed like that was now here. No one offered help. No one offered kindness. Alexis didn't ask for either. She reached into her bag, retrieved her phone, and tapped into the encrypted folder saved under Langston Trust Immediate Action. Her thumb hovered above a single contact, Brendan Walsh, General Counsel for Skylux Aviation's Executive Board. But she didn't hit call. Not yet. She scrolled to another file, an internal compliance clause regarding discriminatory action by airline personnel and its immediate financial consequences. Clause 9C. Her finger paused on the section titled Trigger Conditions. All 3 conditions had been met. The evidence was overwhelming, but she needed more than policy. She needed timing. Beside her, the beverage cart rolled past. The attendant skipped over her row entirely, only stopping to offer water and snacks to the passengers on either side. Alexis raised a hand. "Excuse me," she said. The attendant paused. "Yes." "May I have a glass of water?" Alexis asked. The woman blinked. "Sorry, we've run out of clean cups. I'll come back later." She didn't. Alexis pressed the call button. No one came. 20 minutes passed. She pressed it again. Still nothing. Her palms curled into fists on her knees. This wasn't about comfort anymore. This was about declaration. Brenda had made a choice, several in fact, and those choices carried consequences. Alexis had built her career around consequences. She was the final word in estates worth more than the GDP of small countries. Her signature could greenlight million-dollar disbursements or halt executive bonuses with a line of ink. And this airline, this very plane, was part of the Langston Aviation Group's capital portfolio, over 20% of which was legally bound by her authorization. Her presence on this flight wasn't a coincidence. It was oversight, and Brenda had just turned it into litigation. Alexis opened her phone again and began typing, not a message, but a formal internal report. Every detail from the check-in counter to the security checkpoint to the forced removal from her seat was documented in tight legal language. Dates, times, employee names, exact wording. She titled the document Exhibit A. Her report concluded with a phrase she hadn't used since her last courtroom arbitration. Formal review pending recommendation to suspend capital disbursement. She saved it, closed the file, then, without hesitation, unlocked the encrypted dialer and pressed call. The line clicked once, then twice, before a calm voice answered. Brendan Walsh. Alexis sat upright in seat 32E, her voice low but deliberate. It's Alexis Moore, confirming incident report. I'm currently aboard Flight 2187. Triggering Clause 9C. On the other end, Brendan didn't hesitate. Understood. Is the report ready for internal escalation? Alexis's eyes flicked down to her open folio on her lap, the Exhibit A document glowing faintly on her tablet screen. Filed, time-stamped and categorized. Every violation documented, from pre-boarding discrimination to mid-flight displacement. Brendan inhaled. This isn't going to be quiet. Alexis's gaze sharpened. It's not meant to be. She ended the call, her thumb lingering for a moment before locking the screen. Outside the window across the aisle, clouds drifted by in a soft blur of white and gray, moving far more freely than she had been allowed to today. Her body remained perfectly still, but inside her mind, gears had begun to turn with the force of an engine spooling up. Brenda's actions weren't isolated. They were systemic, embedded in the assumptions that had followed Alexis her entire career, from courthouse to boardroom to first class. But unlike before, today Alexis held not just her credentials, but the leverage of capital. Her control of Langston Trust's $950 million portfolio wasn't theoretical. It was actionable. Her decisions could freeze distributions, cancel renewal contracts, and reroute investments toward more ethical competitors. And now, thanks to what had transpired on this flight, she had cause. Legal, moral, financial, and documented. The plane shuddered gently as it cut through a pocket of wind, rattling the beverage cart still parked 2 rows ahead. Alexis's seatmate finally looked up from his laptop and noticed her for the first time, curiosity twitching in his brow. He didn't speak, just stared, uncertain whether she was someone to avoid or someone important. Alexis didn't bother to engage. Instead, she turned her attention back to her notes, updating the timeline of events with precise timestamps. She included the moment her water request had been denied, the 17-minute delay in acknowledgement, the direct quote from a flight attendant who said, "We're full up front." The language was polite. The message wasn't. It never was. Discrimination rarely arrived shouting, it whispered. Wrapped in professionalism, masked in policy, delivered with a smile. But Alexis had spent years learning how to dissect the silence between words. At 10:47 a.m., the plane reached cruising altitude. Alexis felt the shift in cabin pressure in her ears and in her gut. A junior attendant named Clara finally approached with a tray of cups and a hesitant smile. She glanced down at Alexis and paused. "Would you like some water?" Alexis looked up, eyes neutral. "Yes, thank you." Clara handed her the cup with care, then hesitated. "Is everything okay, ma'am?" Her voice was quiet, careful. Alexis studied her a moment. Young, likely new, nervous, but not unkind. "Not everything," Alexis said softly, "but I appreciate you asking." Clara nodded once, then moved on. A small gesture, not an apology, but a deviation. Someone who sensed the weight in the air, even if she didn't understand the full story. Alexis took a sip from the cup, her grip steady. She could taste the metallic chill of the water, but also the taste of decision. Cool, precise, inevitable. The flight would last another hour. That was enough time to finalize every document necessary to initiate Langston's temporary capital freeze. Enough time to issue a breach notification to Skylux Aviation's legal team. Enough time to write the preliminary board statement that would accompany the announcement. She began composing it now, Due to verified incidents of discriminatory conduct aboard Flight 2187, Langston Trust is placing all active investments in Skylux Aviation under internal review, effective immediately. Quarterly distributions totaling $42.3 million are suspended pending resolution and corrective action. She paused, rereading the statement, letting its weight settle. She hadn't used this authority in years. The last time she had exercised Clause 9C, it resulted in the termination of 3 executives and a full-scale HR audit at a luxury hotel chain. This would be larger, more public, more expensive. But that was the point. Consequences were never convenient. That's why they mattered. As she revised the language further, she heard a sharp voice cut through the cabin. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to put that device away." Alexis glanced up. Brenda stood near row 30, arms crossed. Her voice just loud enough to be heard by surrounding passengers. "We're preparing for in-flight meal service. Devices must be stowed." Alexis tilted her head. "This is a tablet, not a tray table. I'm not in violation of any FAA regulation." Brenda smiled tightly. "Still, I'd prefer it if you complied." Alexis held her gaze. "Of course. Once you can point me to the regulation that mandates it." Brenda didn't answer. She turned without a word and walked away. Alexis lowered her tablet but didn't close it. She returned to her notes, highlighting the time and content of the exchange, then flagged it under retaliation in flight. Her documentation now included 6 separate incidents of questionable behavior. 6. Enough to justify not only a freeze, but a full partnership reevaluation. She could already see the legal language forming in her mind. Cumulative misconduct indicating pattern of bias toward protected class passenger, verified through both direct and secondary behavior during service cycle. The rest would follow: committee reviews, press inquiries, stockholder memos. She wouldn't need to say a word on camera. The numbers would speak for her. The silence of her response would be louder than any headline. Outside, the clouds had thickened, casting a gray sheen over the wing. The seatbelt light blinked on overhead. A slight jolt moved through the fuselage, unnoticed by most. But Alexis noticed everything. She glanced toward the aisle, waiting now, not for turbulence, but for the next predictable attempt at containment. The aircraft rocked gently, a subtle shift that signaled not turbulence, but transition, altitude adjusting, cabin pressure recalibrating, and somewhere beneath it all, the shifting gravity of a decision being made. Alexis took a breath as her thumb hovered over the Langston Trust Secure Communications app, the biometric scanner at the top of her phone pulsing faintly in anticipation. She adjusted the angle slightly, letting the device read her face, and in less than a second, the dashboard opened. A sleek interface showing active directives, dormant clauses, and the comprehensive financial architecture of one of the most powerful private trusts in the country. At the center of the screen, glowing red and waiting, was Clause 9C, Emergency Freeze Authority. Without further delay, Alexis tapped it. A secondary confirmation panel appeared. "Trigger Clause 9C, are you sure?" She entered her legal executor PIN and tapped yes. Immediately, the screen changed to display a cascade of back-end notifications. Legal department notified. Board review triggered. Disbursement pipeline paused. Current amount under review, $125 million. Scope, Aviation Group Skylux, Holdings Incorporated timeline, immediate. She could almost hear the virtual gears grinding as servers processed the instruction, automatically sending digital alerts to compliance officers, external partners, and board leadership. Somewhere in an office on the 49th floor of Langston Tower, Brendan Walsh's phone was lighting up. Somewhere in a downtown law firm, Skylux's outside counsel would soon be scanning a notification they hadn't expected to receive. Not today, not over a single flight. But it was never about a single flight. It was about a pattern, and patterns were the foundation of both data and discrimination. Alexis placed the phone face down on her tray table, watching the blinking light reflect off the glass of water Clara had finally delivered. The silence around her had grown denser, like the air before a courtroom verdict. She was no longer thinking about Brenda or Seat 1A or even the smugness of the man who'd laughed at her earlier. She was thinking in numbers, in fund reallocations, penalty clauses, and investor exit triggers. Each one was a thread she now held between her fingers. She leaned back slightly, letting the cabin noise dissolve into background static. A message arrived. It was from Brendan, encrypted as usual, but brief and unmistakable. Freeze initiated. Full board notified. Press office on standby. Additional details. Alexis typed swiftly, her finger steady. Details filed under Exhibit A. Include timeline and verbatim quotes. Focus on repeated behavioral escalation and failure to remediate upon passenger request. Emphasize breach of ethical service obligations under equity funding terms. She hit send. Less than a minute later, another message followed. Received. Escalating to emergency council. Per protocol, flight personnel will be monitored post-landing. Do you wish to authorize initial incident disclosure to CEO directly? Alexis didn't hesitate. Yes. Use discretion. No names. Just incident category and legal response level. Full report to follow. She locked the phone again and exhaled. Her heart wasn't racing. If anything, it was calmer than it had been all day. The control wasn't in her words or tone. It was in her preparedness. The clarity of process. The assurance that her presence here wasn't random. That every time someone tried to move her aside, she returned, not louder, but stronger. Around her, the cabin lights dimmed slightly in preparation for meal service. A flight attendant appeared near the front with a tray of hot towels and began moving methodically down the aisle. When he reached row 32, he glanced at his list, paused, and then skipped her row entirely. Alexis raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She recorded the time, 11:12 a.m. She noted the omission. At 11:16 a.m., he returned, offering the towel to her seatmate with a pleasant smile. Alexis extended her hand toward him calmly. He looked at her for a moment, then reluctantly handed one over. "We're a bit short, ma'am," he muttered. "I'm sure you understand." Alexis smiled slightly. Of course. She dabbed her fingers, as if she were in a courtroom preparing for closing remarks. The towel was barely warm. The gesture was hollow, but the data was priceless. Every word, every withheld courtesy, every look was part of a larger picture she was assembling, one the board would see in full color within hours. As the tray carts rattled forward again, Brenda reappeared, her voice clipped and professional. "Meal selections are limited today," she announced to the back rows. "We're prioritizing premium cabins. We'll try to accommodate as best we can." Alexis didn't even look up. She reached into her bag and pulled out her own meal. A sealed protein bar and a glass bottle of mineral water. She had learned long ago to travel prepared, not just for hunger, but for humiliation. Brenda passed her row without stopping. Alexis logged the time, 11:24 a.m. She opened her protein bar slowly, deliberately. She was no longer reacting to the treatment. She was documenting the evidence. The same way she would in court, factual, unemotional, unshakable. Behind her, a child cried. Ahead, someone groaned over a missed meal choice. The tension in the cabin was no longer unspoken. It was palpable. Even Clara, the junior attendant, moved slower, more carefully, her eyes scanning the rows like someone afraid of making the wrong choice. Alexis watched her from the corner of her eye, wondering how long it would take before the power shift became visible. Not theatrical, tactical, because power wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was just a single line in a ledger that suddenly stopped flowing. Alexis picked up her phone again and typed a final message to Brendan. Upon landing, have corporate liaison waiting at Jet Bridge. Quiet protocol. No press. Legal priority level. Red 2. Initiate direct contact with Skylux CEO within 30 minutes of landing. I'll join the call. The response came quickly. Affirmative. Legal and finance teams mobilized. Your authority acknowledged and fully backed. Alexis locked her phone again, letting it rest on her tray table. The plane rocked once more, a deeper lurch this time. The captain's voice buzzed through the intercom, calm and clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our initial descent into JFK International. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." Alexis glanced at the time. 11:36 a.m. Descent had begun. So had exposure. She tightened her seatbelt, straightened her jacket, and folded her folio with meticulous care. She wasn't preparing to land. She was preparing to arrive. And she knew exactly who would be waiting when the aircraft door opened. The wheels struck the runway with a hollow thud, the aircraft bouncing gently before the reverse thrusters roared to life, pressing everyone backward in their seats as deceleration surged through the cabin. Alexis remained still, spine straight, fingers folded over the leather of her closed folio, eyes fixed on the back of the seat ahead. The descent had ended, but her momentum was just beginning. Around her, passengers stirred, reaching for bags, stretching limbs, refreshing their carefully curated appearances. Alexis didn't move. She had no need to. Her performance was already prepared. It lived not in her expression, but in the chain of events already set in motion. Legal, financial, institutional. The cabin speakers crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to New York's JFK International Airport. For your safety, please remain seated until we have reached the gate and the captain has turned off the seatbelt sign." The tone was standard. The implication for Alexis was not. Her eyes drifted to the forward galley where Brenda now stood, arms crossed, her face unreadable, though the flicker of discomfort in her jaw had begun to show. Alexis could sense the ripple already forming, not among the passengers, but behind the scenes, in conference rooms and email servers, in legal inboxes lighting up with the same alert. Clause 9C triggered. Aviation equity freeze in effect. Awaiting response from Executive Board. As the aircraft taxied toward its designated gate, Alexis opened her phone once more and watched as the status of her legal directive shifted from pending to live. A new line of data appeared, meeting scheduled. Skylux Holdings Executive Legal Briefing. Location, JFK Private Terminal, Conference Wing B. Time, 12:45 p.m. Her arrival wasn't simply being acknowledged. It was being coordinated. The plane came to a full stop, the overhead lights blinking into full brightness. A collective sigh of travel-weary relief passed through the cabin as seatbelts unlatched in chorus. People stood, shuffled into the aisles, all eager to disembark. But a voice from the intercom stopped the flow. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that all passengers remain seated for just a moment. We have a brief procedural update. Thank you for your cooperation." Heads turned. Murmurs began. No one knew what the procedural update was, but Alexis did. She rose slowly, smoothing the lapels of her blazer, then retrieved her briefcase from beneath the seat. She moved with practiced control, a calmness that didn't ask permission. In the front galley, Brenda's posture had shifted slightly, her shoulders tense, eyes flicking toward the door as it clicked open. A ground operations agent entered, followed closely by two men in dark suits and earpieces, and a third, more conservatively dressed man carrying a slim leather binder. The lead man scanned the cabin with a brief glance, then spotted Alexis. His demeanor changed instantly. "Ms. Moore," he asked, voice quiet but firm. "I'm Jordan Hayes, Director of Strategic Operations. We'd like a word with you upstairs if you're available." Brenda blinked. Alexis didn't. "Of course," she replied. She stepped forward, pausing as the man turned back to gesture for his colleagues to make way. Brenda opened her mouth slightly as if to interject, but her voice caught in her throat. Jordan turned to her. "Ms. Brenda Carlisle?" She nodded, almost reflexively. "You'll be debriefed separately by compliance. For now, please remain on board." The color drained subtly from Brenda's face, but she nodded again, this time with less certainty. Passengers watched, some trying to appear as if they weren't listening, others outright staring. The man who had mocked Alexis earlier now looked confused, lips parted slightly, as though trying to connect the dots of a puzzle he hadn't realized he was part of. Alexis walked through the jet bridge flanked by the three men, her heels clicking against the metal floor with the rhythm of inevitability. As they emerged into the private terminal, a black town car idled near the service entrance, while another Skylux representative held open the elevator leading to the executive level. Inside the lift, Jordan briefed her in short, efficient sentences. The board was notified approximately 53 minutes ago. Legal and investor relations have prepped your preferred conference suite. CEO Mark Talbot is flying in from Boston. He'll join via secure line. Brendan Walsh will co-host the review. We've marked the meeting as critical priority, red level 2. Alexis listened in silence, nodding once. And the disbursement status? Frozen, Jordan confirmed. Confirmed internally and acknowledged by Skylux Holdings as of 12:32. Public disclosure remains pending your instruction. Hold it, she said, until after the board has heard the full report. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, revealing a gleaming corridor of glass and dark wood, where a long conference table stood beneath a bank of recessed lighting. Legal pads had been laid out, water bottles lined in military symmetry, and at the head of the table, a 72-inch display showed a live link to the Langston Tower boardroom in Manhattan. Alexis walked in first, her presence filling the space not with sound, but with certainty. Her chair had already been marked name, A, more title, executor, Langston estate status, equity stakeholder. She took her seat, placed her folio before her, and waited. Jordan leaned over slightly. They'll be ready in 2 minutes. Alexis nodded. That's all I'll need. 1 minute and 52 seconds later, the main screen came to life. The Langston board members appeared in a neatly tiled array, faces familiar, voices measured. Brendan's voice rang through the speakers. We're live. Alexis, the board is yours. She opened the folio, glanced once at her notes, then began. Alexis didn't clear her throat, didn't preface her words with performative gratitude, didn't adjust her posture for the camera. She didn't need to. Authority didn't have to announce itself when it was contractual, when it was embedded in the very oxygen these executives breathed. She placed her hand firmly on the folio, opened it with practiced precision, and began speaking in the same cadence she used when delivering final arbitration before federal judges. As of this morning, multiple instances of conduct in violation of the Langston Trust's ethical investment clauses have occurred aboard Flight 2187, operated by Skylux Holdings. Her voice was steady, cool, clinical. Specifically, clauses 9C and 14E, covering discriminatory service behavior, abuse of power by flight personnel, and retaliatory treatment of verified equity partners, have been breached. On the screen, faces began to shift subtly. A woman in the lower left corner adjusted her glasses and glanced down at something off camera. A man near the top cleared his throat but said nothing. Alexis continued. Based on this breach and the documentation provided, I am, under full authority granted by the Langston Trust's executive charter, initiating a Level 2 equity freeze. All disbursements to Skylux Holdings are now suspended, effective immediately. There was a moment of silence, so deep it felt like the room itself had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. Brendan nodded from his window, tapping at something off-screen. Jordan Hayes, seated beside her, turned a page in the meeting packet and placed it face up for all to see. Total withheld: $125 million. Primary impact: $42.3 million aircraft maintenance allocation, Q3 disbursement. One of the executives, a red-faced man named Collins from finance, finally spoke. That includes the entire Q3 maintenance package? Alexis nodded once. Correct. Collins leaned forward, disbelief thick in his voice. That contract was signed 6 months ago. It's active. Alexis responded without blinking. So was the ethical conduct clause. And unlike the maintenance package, it was violated. Another board member, this one from Investor Relations, chimed in. Are we being offered a corrective pathway before this goes public? Alexis flipped a page in her folio, revealing a single printed paragraph. Remediation options are outlined here. Staff-wide compliance recertification, formal apology to the impacted party, full internal investigation led by an independent firm of our choosing, and the immediate removal of personnel named in the complaint, pending full review. Personnel, the IR executive repeated, brow furrowing. Alexis didn't hesitate. Chief Flight Attendant Brenda Carlisle and gate personnel Tyler W. and Troy D., all of whom are referenced in my report with direct quotations, timestamps, and corroborating video footage from onboard surveillance. Brendan nodded solemnly. We've pulled the internal logs. The timestamps align with Ms. Moore's report. Passenger cam footage also supports her claim of being escorted from first class without procedural cause. Alexis didn't look smug. She didn't need to. She simply added, furthermore, the language used by Ms. Carlisle in flight, in the presence of other passengers, includes a quote that directly contradicts your own anti-bias training guidelines. She pulled the transcript. She doesn't look like someone who belongs in 1A. That statement alone is sufficient to trigger Clause 14E. The woman in the lower left corner, General Counsel for Skylux, leaned forward now, her voice quiet but sharp. Are we looking at press involvement? Brendan replied before Alexis could. Not unless the board fails to initiate corrective action within 48 hours. At that point, Langston Trust reserves the right to make public their investment reevaluation. Collins rubbed his temples. 48 hours, he repeated, to clean up a mess we created in 4 minutes of arrogance. Alexis said nothing. She let the words hang. A younger man in the far right corner, clearly new, perhaps an assistant VP, whispered to his boss, unaware his mic was hot. She's not just a lawyer. She's the one signing the checks. Alexis's eyes flicked toward the screen, but said nothing. The CEO of Skylux, still remote from Boston, finally joined the call. His square filled the center screen, gray suit, tired eyes, voice full of pressure. Ms. Moore, he said, we're reviewing your documentation in full. I'll personally oversee the response team. I apologize for the unacceptable experience you've had, and I take full accountability. Alexis folded her hands over the folio again. This isn't personal, she said. It's structural. But the accountability is appreciated. The CEO nodded once. You'll have a formal letter by end of day. If it satisfies your legal conditions, I request the trust reconsider full divestment. This airline can't afford a shareholder rebellion right now. Alexis tilted her head. That's not up to me alone. But I'll forward the letter to the full advisory panel. If it's sincere, and if actions match the words, there's room for negotiation. The CEO exhaled. Understood. Jordan Hayes passed her a tablet. It displayed a digital signature portal. Authorized release of the freeze once compliance is confirmed, he whispered. Alexis tapped her initials, but left the freeze active. Pending fulfillment, she said. Not before. The executives nodded, most of them now quiet, some scribbling notes, others simply watching. She closed the folio slowly, deliberately, and looked around the room. This could have been avoided. But now that it's happened, it will be remembered. Let's ensure what follows is worth remembering too. The screen dimmed. The meeting ended. Jordan stood beside her. The press doesn't know yet, he said. But they're sniffing. The cameras are lining up outside the private terminal. Alexis turned to him, her voice low. I won't speak to them. They'll ask why you froze the money. They already know. They'll ask who you are. She picked up her bag and stepped toward the door. Then let them come see. The automatic doors of the executive terminal opened into blinding midday light as Alexis stepped outside, escorted by Jordan Hayes and 2 senior compliance officers whose radios buzzed faintly with low-priority updates from airport security. The town car waited just ahead, engine running, windows tinted to black. She didn't move toward it immediately. Instead, she paused at the edge of the curb, hands clasped calmly in front of her as if absorbing the weight of everything that had just unfolded upstairs. Her eyes scanned the concrete expanse ahead, not looking for press, not looking for attention, just reading the moment like a court transcript. She didn't need a statement. Her name was already attached to one of the most significant financial holds in the airline's history. She turned slightly as Jordan approached, his voice low and even. Legal is coordinating directly with HR, he said. Brenda Carlisle has been pulled from active duty. Her employee badge was disabled 3 minutes ago. Internal Affairs will begin interviews tonight. Alexis nodded without surprise. And the gate staff? Both placed on administrative leave pending investigation. We've already secured security footage from Terminal A and cabin surveillance. It's conclusive. Alexis didn't ask to see it. She didn't need to. The behavior had already been etched into memory, filed away alongside the countless other encounters she'd experienced in more subtle shades over the years. The difference this time was that the impact wasn't silent, it echoed, in withheld millions, in frozen contracts, in panicked emails racing across corporate servers. She glanced toward the terminal entrance, where a mid-level attorney was stepping out hurriedly. Phone pressed to his ear, his face flushed and voice hushed. As he passed, Alexis caught a single line. If Langston pulls out, we lose the Asia-Pacific renewal entirely. Her expression didn't change. She hadn't made the threat, they had. She had simply followed through. Another executive emerged behind him, fumbling with a lanyard and phone simultaneously, muttering to someone through his earpiece. We need a statement ready in under 3 hours or the market will react. Hard. They're already watching. Alexis moved past them without acknowledgement. She reached the car, placed her bag in the rear seat herself, and then paused, hand on the door. Jordan, she said, turning back. Confirm with Brendan that I want the compliance clause reinforced in all equity contracts going forward. Jordan raised an eyebrow. You mean for all Langston investments? Yes, she said. Not just aviation. Hospitality, logistics, private security. If they touch our capital, they answer to our code. Jordan tapped it into his tablet instantly, then nodded. Consider it done. She slid into the car, the leather seat cool beneath her, as the door clicked shut. Inside, the driver nodded politely and awaited direction. Alexis didn't speak yet. Her eyes lingered on the glass, watching as airport personnel scurried back and forth like chess pieces repositioning after a checkmate. Her phone buzzed on the seat beside her. A message from Brendan appeared. Skylux CEO wants to send a private jet to Langston Tower tomorrow for negotiation. Your call. She typed one word. Decline. Another buzz came through before the first one had faded. A forward from Langston's PR director. 3 press outlets requesting comment. 2 requesting exclusive. Do you wish to respond? Alexis replied. Prepare a joint statement from Langston Trust and Langston Legal. Focus on ethics, not incident. 0 mention of names. Position it as a systemic correction, not a personal grievance. Within 60 seconds, her inbox lit up again, this time from Skylux's outside legal team. A forwarded chain from an internal leak had hit a financial blog. Langston Trust suspends $125 million over discrimination claim. Alexis read the headline, then the subheading, exclusive. Source confirms incident tied to high-profile black female executive and in-flight behavior from senior airline staff. She locked the phone calmly, so it had begun. Not just the consequence, but the exposure. She leaned back, letting the hum of the car soften the noise outside. The skyline of Manhattan waited in the distance, like a jury that hadn't yet been summoned. Her mind wasn't focused on media spin, on apologies crafted by legal wordsmiths, or even on the financial tremor Skylux would now feel. It was elsewhere, on the ripple effect this would cause across Langston's investment partners, on the next boardroom that might second-guess its behavior before offering a cup of water or a seat assignment. Her eyes narrowed as she thought through the operational impact. Brenda's dismissal wouldn't just be a personnel matter, it would be a compliance precedent. Tyler and Troy's leave would echo through HR manuals across every major terminal Skylux operated. Her freeze didn't just halt a financial stream. It redirected it into audits, into training, into review panels that now had to answer to her documentation. It wasn't punishment. It was reform. One forged not in outrage, but in logic and precision. The phone buzzed again. This time, it was an internal message from the Langston Diversity Oversight Council. Would you consider chairing the newly proposed Equity Enforcement Subcommittee? Full authority, Budget to follow your recommendation. Alexis stared at the message. Her lips curved slightly. The car pulled forward into the stream of traffic, sliding between trucks and taxis as the airport began to fade behind them. On the side mirror, Alexis caught one last glimpse of Terminal A and the metal bird she'd flown in on, still parked under a crisp spring sky. The door she'd been denied, the seat she'd been removed from, the silence she'd been offered instead of service. None of it had followed her. All of it stayed back there, now buried under consequence. She picked up her phone and started to type a response to the Oversight Council, then stopped. Her eyes lifted as the driver's voice came through the intercom. Ms. Moore, do you want to head to Langston Tower directly, or do you prefer to stop by your residence first? Alexis looked ahead at the skyline, her voice calm, unwavering. Tower, she said. There's still more work to be done. And as the car surged forward into the narrowing lanes of the expressway, she opened her folio one more time, flipping past the documentation for Skylux and landing on the next tab, already labeled in bold. Next review. United Dominion Hotels. Client complaint Atlanta, March 3rd. Her fingers poised above the heading, ready to annotate, when suddenly the driver's voice interrupted again. The Langston Tower rose like a verdict cast in stone, its glass exterior reflecting the restless Manhattan skyline. And as Alexis stepped out of the elevator onto the executive floor, she could feel the momentum of her actions still pulsing through the marble beneath her heels. The corridors were quieter than usual, not out of fear, but reverence, a sort of silent awe that followed someone who hadn't just defended her name, but had shifted the landscape with it. Assistants straightened when she passed, and partners paused their calls mid-sentence, not because they were intimidated, but because they understood that something tectonic had shifted since she boarded that flight. She nodded once to the receptionist outside the boardroom and continued down the hall, not toward her office, but toward the HR annex, where a meeting had been called at Brenda Carlisle's request. It was unusual, but not entirely unexpected. After a reckoning, there's often an echo, a moment where the one brought low looks up and wonders what remains. Alexis entered the conference room, where Jordan Hayes and Brendan Walsh already sat quietly. Brenda stood near the window, out of uniform, her posture stiff, her expression somewhere between humility and fear. She turned when Alexis entered, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, voice trembling as she spoke. Ms. Moore, I requested this meeting. Not because I expect forgiveness, I don't deserve it, but I needed to say something while I still had the courage to say it. Alexis said nothing, only sat across from her, her silence more potent than any rebuttal. Brenda swallowed hard, eyes damp but not pleading. I judge you, not by your conduct, not by your title, not even by your words, just by your skin. I saw what I was conditioned to see, someone who didn't belong in first class, someone who couldn't possibly hold power, someone whose value I measured by an image that was never yours to carry. Jordan shifted slightly in his chair, his pen resting motionless on his legal pad, while Brendan kept his gaze low, allowing the moment to pass unimpeded. Brenda continued, her voice cracking only once. That wasn't just ignorance. It was arrogance. I didn't just fail at my job. I failed at humanity. Alexis finally spoke, her voice low and deliberate. You didn't fail because you made a mistake. You failed because you made it easy. You didn't stop to question it. You enforced it. You turned judgment into protocol and called it policy. Brenda nodded slowly, every syllable landing like a sentence. I understand that now, and I'm not asking to reverse anything. I lost my position. I may lose my license, but I'd rather lose those than lose the chance to tell the truth. Alexis leaned forward slightly, folding her hands atop the table. The truth doesn't restore trust. It acknowledges the debt. You owe that to every passenger who was ever dismissed, to every voice that was ever silenced beneath your ma'am, to every standard you applied unequally and called neutral. Brenda's eyes welled but didn't break. I know. Alexis studied her for a long moment, then stood, lifting her bag onto her shoulder. Then let that mistake cost you enough to never make it again. She didn't say more. She didn't need to. The room was already heavy with what had been lost, and what might still be reclaimed. Brenda lowered her head slightly, not in defeat, but in understanding. As Alexis walked past Jordan and Brendan, neither man said a word, but both rose instinctively, as if in silent recognition of the final gavel that had just fallen. Outside the room, the hallway stretched long and bright, sunlight pouring through the high windows like something renewed. Alexis didn't pause. She moved forward, steady, grounded, but not hardened. Her power had never come from retaliation. It came from restraint, from the discipline to answer injustice not with noise, but with undeniable fact, irreversible consequence, and unshakable presence. Downstairs, her town car waited again. But this time, when she stepped inside, she didn't immediately reach for her folio or phone. She let the silence sit with her, not heavy, but full. The driver glanced at her through the mirror. "Langston Tower again, Ms. Moore." She shook her head gently. "Not today." He nodded, merging onto the avenue as city blocks passed in a rhythm only New York could compose. Alexis looked out the window, her reflection mingling with the skyline. She didn't see a woman who had won a battle. She saw someone who had changed the battlefield. Behind her, a corporation had been forced to look inward. Ahead, 100 others might think twice before assuming they knew who belonged where. Her phone buzzed quietly in her lap. A new email. Subject line: Langston Trust Strategic Review Committee Nomination. She didn't open it yet. Instead, she closed her eyes for one brief moment, the sunlight warming her face through the glass. And when she opened them again, the city was still there, unmoved, relentless, watching. Just like her. If you've made it this far, you're clearly someone who values justice served with precision. So tell us, what part of this story hit you the hardest? Was it the moment Alexis stood her ground, or when the system finally had to answer for its silence? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. And let us know where in the world you're watching from. If stories like this resonate with you, and you want to see more narratives where power, principle, and courage collide, go ahead and hit subscribe. We're just getting started.